Welcome to In the Margins. I'm your host. My name is David Pluviose, and I'm so glad and grateful to have today as our guest, Dr. Jasmine Harris, who serves as an associate professor of African American Studies and coordinator of the African American Studies program in the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Dr. Harris is also the author of a new book titled Black Women Ivory Tower, revealing the lies of white supremacy in American education. Dr. Harris, welcome. Thank you for joining us here for In the Margins. So glad you could be with us today. I wanted to start off asking you about your background. In your book, of course, you wrote vividly about your experiences in the run-up to going to Vassar for your undergraduate education and the path there and the challenges you faced there, of course, as one of very few African-American females at that institution. I was wondering if you could talk about your own journey through education and higher education as a Black female, and how your experience has informed the research you do currently.
Yeah, I grew up in Minneapolis, which is not the most diverse city, especially so when I was growing up there in the 80s and 90s. But I was always interested in learning. I started reading at a young age. I started trying to write books, at 7 or 8, to sort of mimic the things that I was reading. And at home and, with my family, that was all well and good. But very early on in my educational experiences in Minnesota in particular, I realized that there was an unwelcomeness that I didn't exactly have the language for at the time, obviously, but something felt to me where I understood that I like to learn, I like to read, right? But that in the classroom or at school, the experiences that I had were not positive, right? And by that, I talk about in the book being, pushed down in the snow by a little white boy that I was riding the bus home with. And there are those sorts of things, right? But there's also just this sort of general unwelcomeness. Non-belonging is something that I talk about a lot in the book that I could sense, but I couldn't explain, right? Through elementary school, middle school, high school, that continued to present itself. And when it was time to apply for colleges, I was sort of at a loss. I had good grades. I was deeply involved on campus. And I knew that I wanted to go to college, but I wasn't exactly sure where I would fit in those experiences. And I leaned heavily on my mother, who was a college graduate. She sort of understood that sense of non-belonging, but also was very savvy about how I might overcome those things and still be able to sort of utilize the networks that you develop by going to particular colleges and universities like Vassar. And, for me, I didn't know what was awaiting me there, and I knew that it was going to be mostly white students. I knew that I would be one of very few Black women students on campus, but I didn't necessarily understand what that meant. And it wasn't really until I got to graduate school in my doctoral program, and I started to think about what I wanted to write my dissertation about, what I was doing there, really, having left a pretty successful public relations career to go back to school. And that's when I started reading Du Bois and Hurston and getting to read these experiences of Black people in schools and in predominantly white settings more broadly, that suddenly provided a language for the things that I was experiencing that I didn't have before. And as a sociologist, that's my PhD is in sociology, I was able to really do an analysis of experiences. And my dissertation is on the career trajectories of Black women in the Minneapolis and St. Paul area. And that topic was driven by watching my mom's experiences as a professional woman and Black woman in that area. And so I was having all of these experiences in education, right? But I didn't know how they fit together. I didn't know what they were explaining to me and highlighting to all of us about the structure of and culture of education in the United States. And once I started to have the language and I started to learn the methodology for this kind of study, I was hooked, right? And since then, all of my research, my teaching, my service on campuses is really dedicated to trying to understand the experiences of Black people in predominantly white settings in higher education for this book, but more broadly as well for some of the other research that I'm doing. And I think, in the vein of Du Bois, in the vein of Patricia Hill Collins, that it is important work. It's important that it is Black people, Black women studying other Black women's experiences and not letting white people in the discipline, white people in these institutions decide how to explain and describe and address the experiences that we have there.
You mentioned that you had a successful career in public relations before deciding to go back to graduate school. And I do want to ask specifically why a career in the academy. We know, of course, the process of publishing and, of course, teaching and the tenure. There's so many challenges in the academy that cause many, even who choose that path, to get off that path. So why a career in the academy? I was wondering if you talk about what ultimately convinced you to go that route.
Honestly, say I hated the 9-to-5 schedule structure. I am someone who needs to have some sort of control over my day, my schedule, the things that I'm working on. And while I really enjoyed the work of public relations, I just realized that the business structure, that sort of typical corporate structure, wasn't for me. I remember I moved out to San Francisco after I finished. I have a master's degree in public relations. So I moved out to San Francisco to work in PR out there. And after the first week, I think it was the Friday of the first week, I called my mother as I was walking home. And I was just in tears. Like, you've been doing this every day for 25 years. Like, this is awful. And it's not helping. Right. And I think it was in that moment that I realized that I wanted to do something that was more. I talk about this a little bit in the book. I don't know, at the time I was 25, that I realized that going back to get my doctorate meant that I was also going to have a career in the academy. And I honestly, didn't know what it meant to have a career in the academy. One Black professor in college who was, admittedly very busy with the few of us that were on campus. And so she had to, divide her time. And that made it so we didn't get to interact perhaps as much as I would have liked. And had professors, but I didn't know what that job entailed. Or, you talked about tenure and all of these things. I had no idea. I had never written an academic, a scientific academic paper before I went back to get my doctorate. And so a lot of it was naivete, right? Where there are so many of my cohort mates, colleagues who have parents who were PhDs or grandparents, or aunts or uncles, or who had sort of been following this track as a goal for a long time. I came in essentially with nothing. And, in a lot of ways that put me behind many of the other students in my program at the University of Minnesota. And so I know that that's not like the sexy answer, but I honestly didn't know what I was getting myself into. And when students came to me and asked me about being a professor, about going to a doctoral program, the thing that I always tell them is one big takeaway that I have is that, especially for Black women, the process is about perseverance, right? It's not measuring any intellect, right? It is about the ability to jump through hoops, your ability to commit to the sort of particular culture and structure of doctoral programs and the socialization that they do to turn you into a professor in a lot of ways. And I'll also say, because I came to that without any of that information or experience, I, also butted heads with the people in power in my program a lot, because what they were asking was very sort of culturally blind, right? And so, for example, at the University of Minnesota, first year doctoral students were required to attend workshops, and I can't remember what day, it was Tuesday or Wednesday, one day a week. They would hold these workshops where they would bring in other academics to give talks about their research. And, anybody from the department was encouraged to come, right? So it's like staying on top of the current research in the discipline. But for first year doctoral students, not only were we required to go, where for everyone else it was a voluntary appearance, we were also required to sit at the table sort of in the middle of the room and ask the first question. And I did this for a couple of months, and it felt like hazing to me. One, as the only one Black student in my doctoral program, and two, these workshops happened at 4:00 in the afternoon, and I was a doctoral student who was on fellowship, but I also had lots of jobs. I remember trying to sort of commiserate with some of my cohort mates about why we shouldn't be required to do this, right? And while they agreed, nobody was really interested in pushing the envelope. And so I did, I reached out to the director of graduate studies and I said, this feels like hazing and it doesn't fit into my schedule. And I understand, I had a cohort mate who was right out of undergrad, who was living at home, being supported by her family. And that was true of a lot of doctoral students, in part because you have to have a particular class identity, to be able to make doctoral programs work, even if you're fully funded. But that ignores that lots of people of color that are trying to get doctorates can't ask family members for monetary help. They can't live at home. They're doing this and doing other things. And the idea that this is a requirement, and if I don't do it, I can no longer be in the program. Well, that's how you end up with a lot of PhDs, right? And luckily, being someone with a background in PR, I was able to make this argument, very clearly and directly and convincingly, and they acquiesced, and they said, understandable. You don't need to go, and I stopped going unless it was something that was really of interest to me, and that allowed me to work and make money. But I think something that we often forget when we talk about the academy and who's there and who's not is what the structure and culture of higher education is that perpetuates that absence or the sort of over-representation of particular folks. And so, I think a lot of people, again, in this sort of vein of class, a lot of people are unaware, in part because of the messaging that they get in the media, that most faculty members, especially assistant and associate professors, are making less than $100,000 a year. And I will tell you that my PhD costs more than $100,000, right? And so when we create this and perpetuate this culture and this structure of higher education, we are asking certain people not to be there. And in a lot of ways, my lack of knowledge about higher education is what really allowed me to persevere. Because I think if I had come in with this sort of clear understanding of the expectations and what academia was going to be like for me post-doctorate, I probably wouldn't have done it. I tell my students that all the time, but because I just came in with this thirst for knowledge, right? This disinterest in the corporate structure, an interest in educating people. And that was sort of my finite goal. I want to be able to educate people, whatever that looks like, allowed me to sort of shift and move throughout academia in ways that are unexpected, but that continue to push the envelope of what this institution, what this job can be.
I want to ask you about this national anti-DEI push. Obviously you are in Texas, and of course in Texas and in many other states, of course, there's this overt political push against diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, you are helping to build a Black Studies program in Texas amid this big anti-DEI push. And just very interestingly, we talk about, and you talk about the challenge as a Black woman in particular, navigating the majority spaces in higher education. Of course, many in the community celebrated the ascension of Dr. Claudine Gay at Harvard as president. And, interestingly enough, though we see, of course, she stepped down and we see the furor over anti-Semitism, but what's coming behind that, I find interesting. What's coming behind that are people saying this is one of their many salvos against DEI. We took down Dr. Gay and we're going after so many others. And so I was wondering if you could talk about your work in this climate of anti-DEI in Texas in particular, but also I was wondering if you take a national view as well, because it appears as if the champions of those who want to take down DEI are having some victories, which is alarming many in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's alarming to me, as you said, someone who's trying to build an African American studies program in Texas, where the Texas legislature is directly contesting what we do at colleges and universities in this state. And in fact, our DEI office, the Office of Inclusive Excellence at UTSA, was recently closed to be in compliance with the anti-DEI bill that was here. And that is concerning because just 6 weeks ago, our own administration was telling us that it was simply going to be sort of a renaming and a sort of shuffling of the office itself, right? And then all of a sudden, right after the new year, it was actually we're going to just to shutter it. And the mistake, and I think that this is a purposeful mistake in thinking about the DEI, is around this narrative, this fallacy narrative, right? That Black people get things that they do not deserve. And in particular, things that they don't deserve that white people want, right? And so when we talk about DEI offices at colleges and universities, it is this idea that those organizations and the people who are working within them have a vested interest in the uplifting of Black people that in this, fallacy narrative can only happen if you are also degrading the experiences of white students and white people in these institutions. And I think that it's really interesting that they're making these connections to anti-Semitism because Harvard and, the Ivy League schools that are molded in Harvard's image were first concerned with an overpopulation of Jewish students on their campuses. That is how we get admissions offices. Before 1910, Harvard didn't have an admissions office or admissions policies, right? You wrote a letter and, the administration sort of looked at it and made decisions, or you knew someone, or your father went there, right? It was this very sort of closed network. And, pre-World War I, you start to see more immigration and Jewish people in particular gravitating toward these schools. And there are actually all of these letters that are written between presidents and administrators across these institutions, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton in particular, that are hand-wringing about the number of Jewish students that they have there, right? And what do we do to ensure that these schools remain in the sort of Protestant upper class white male image that they were created, right? And so it is anti-Semitism that leads us to institutions making decisions about who gets in and who doesn't based on, their race, their ethnicity, their religion. In the 1940s, that's when they start thinking about Black people, right? Because before that, there wasn't even an option for Black people to attend. There were some anomalies here and there. Du Bois, for example, who had to go and study over in Germany before he could come back and study at Harvard. But in general, Black people were not allowed, right? And post World War II, you have all of these Black veterans coming back to the United States with the GI Bill to now pay for tuition. And there is all of this messaging, which was, meant to encourage folks to take up arms and go to war, right? But all this messaging about what you can do with your GI Bill when you come home. Even Vassar, which is an all-girls school, right? They took in some male students post-World War II via the GI Bill. 0 of those people were Black, right? And so, what you were saying earlier about what comes down the pipeline after, in the example of Claudine Gay, they use these accusations of anti-Semitism as a way to make her vulnerable, right? And once her reputation became vulnerable, then you can, start in with the anti-Blackness, right? Then you can start to question whether or not she plagiarized her dissertation or other articles that she's written. And, I have what folks don't understand, right, in academia is that citation practices are variable at best across disciplines. And you're talking about things that were written in the late 90s, early 2000s, when a lot of articles weren't even digitized yet, right? And so if we're going to, and the billionaire who was sort of at the impetus of these accusations of plagiarism. Now, his wife, who is also a professor at Harvard, has been accused of plagiarism by Business Insider. Apparently, whole sections of her dissertation were taken from Wikipedia, right? But and in his discussion about this, right, he's like, well, my wife is human and she makes mistakes. And the implication in that is that Dr. Gay is not human.
Mm-hmm.
She is not allowed to make mistakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
Black people to be in places like Harvard or Vassar or Princeton, we we don't just have to be better, right? I mean, there's all of that. And your parents tell you have to work twice as hard, right? Do twice as much as white people to get half as much as they get. Not just that, right? It's that even when we get to those places, we are still dehumanized, right? We are still consistently vulnerable to these questions about whether or not we belong in those places. And I think it's really interesting that President McGill at University of Pennsylvania, who also testified, at the hearing, and was also accused of anti-Semitism because of her continued support for free speech, which is the same thing that Dr. Gay was saying. She also resigned from the University of Pennsylvania, right? But without all of the questions and accusations about her belongingness, right? Without all of this dehumanization of her as a person. And that's because she was a white woman. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Gay is a Black woman. And that allows those things to be called into question. And so nationally and here in Texas, we are not just fighting to be seen and be heard, right? We're fighting to be thought of as human. Mm-hmm. And in a state like Texas, that is so diverse, right? And here in San Antonio, it's a majority Mexican population, to still have white politicians in power, white university presidents, buying into that and complying with that dehumanization, it doesn't bode well for what's happening nationally. And then the last thing I'll say about this is, it's not by coincidence that this hearing, Dr. Gay, the president of Harvard, Dr. McGill, the president of Penn, Dr. Kornbluth, the president of MIT, and also, I don't know the president of Columbia's name, but they also asked the Columbia president to attend, and they said no, which probably is what everybody should say, mm-hmm. Right? But that's not by accident, right? These are the schools that are at the center of sort of the cultural zeitgeist of higher education. They move the needle in terms of broader social understandings of higher education, even though the majority of people with college degrees are never going to attend those schools, right? Harvard admits, 4% of students every year? I think MIT is close to that. Maybe Penn is a little bit higher at 6 to 8%, but these aren't the schools where most people are going. Mm-hmm. But if you can do this at these schools, right? If you can call into question the Black woman president at Harvard, then you're really going to have an easier time getting the president of UTSA to comply with these things.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could talk about the book, Black Woman Ivory Tower. It's just very interesting looking at how white supremacy has manifested itself in different places. You talk about Texas, where it's overt, right? We have lawmakers passing bills, but in other states that have more "quote unquote" liberal reputations, we see white supremacy a little bit undercover. But you mentioned, attitudes at a place like Harvard, right? Attitudes that dehumanize Black people and Black women in particular. And so I was wondering if you could talk about the book and why you wrote the book and how you think this book is relevant. It seemed as if it's coming out right on time. So much is happening. Not that these issues were not always pressing, but the age that we're living in, the attack against DEI is so fervent. So I was wondering if you talk about why you wrote this book and what you hope to accomplish with this book, given the times that we're living in.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was previously at small liberal arts college outside of Philadelphia called Ursinus. And while I was there, it must have been my third year there, I wanted to bring Vassar faculty member. She wasn't a faculty member there when I was a student there, but she is a Black woman, English professor. I just written a book about Black women that I thought was really interesting, and was a part of the sociology department. We had some funds to bring someone to campus to give a talk, and it was approved. And as a part of that, someone will come, they'll give the talk, and usually there's some other events. In this case, we held dinner after her talk for some of the other Black faculty and non-Black faculty who expressed interest in meeting with her and having a conversation. So we had this dinner, and I tell this story in the book, although the person's name same here. We are having dinner, and it's the end of the fall semester, and we are, commiserating about weird requests that we get from students about changing their grades, about accepting late work and all of that. Very lighthearted conversation. And a white woman faculty member who was in attendance attempts to sort of join into this conversation, and she says something to the effect of, I had a Black woman student come to me and ask me to raise her grade from an A- to an A because she's a senior and she wants to go to medical school, and she's concerned, about this grade. This is in a science class. This grade in particular affecting, what schools she's able to get into or not. And the woman says, and I just told her, don't worry about it. You're a Black woman. Of course you're going to get into medical school. And she laughs, right? And the rest of us just are silent. And I think we're a little stunned, right? That she would even, say something like that to us. Mm-hmm. We are a little upset, definitely. But we don't really say anything. Nobody responds. Somebody says something else, changes the subject, then it's over. Until it's over, right? We all go to our respective homes, and then the phone calls start, right? And we're all on the phone like, oh my God, I can't believe she said that. I have to call, the woman who is my guest, right? And apologize that she was, exposed to this while on campus, and I brought her here. We're trying to talk about, who do we tell? What do we say? Is this something that is, if we start talking about it, is going to blow up? I was an assistant professor at the time, so, thinking about tenure as well. And this is a woman who was already tenured and, sort of stepping on all of those feet. And it was just a mess. I felt embarrassed. I felt, ashamed. I felt upset. But I wasn't exactly sure what to do. None of us really were. And a few days later, I was talking to my mother about it. And not just that one instance, but just more broadly, like, this is the crap that we have to deal with all the time. And it's so frustrating, that we can't even have a dinner, right? Without all this racism just like bubbling to the surface, and this person not even recognizing the racism in the things that she's saying.
Yeah.
And my mom, she said something that really, put a light bulb up for me. She said, every time we get on the phone and you talk about your job, you have a story like this. You should just write about it. And I should say that my mother is one of those people who has sort of very grandiose plans. Like if I'll say something and she's like, well, you should call Oprah and see if she can do it. And it's like, oh, okay. Yes, I will figure out how to get that in front of Oprah, right? She's never ever thinking about how difficult something is. She's just like, seems like something we can do. Can you do that? And I laughed it off at first. And the more that I thought about it, I started taking notes in my notebook, just writing little stories down. I'm like, oh yeah, then that happened to me. And then that happened to me. And it just started to build itself, right? And it starts with me, right? And it starts with my family, the women in my family. But what became really interesting to me very early on was the sort of history of Black women in higher education and our invisibility, even though we have been a part of higher education for the last, 250 years. That persistent invisibility means that a white woman professor can tell a Black woman student not to worry about her grade because she's definitely going to get into medical school. Because that's that narrative fallacy, right? That Black people just get. And really that started with Ronald Reagan, a lot of Ronald Reagan, right? When his, again, false narrative about this welfare queen that's taking advantage of all the social services. And that really snowballed into this idea that we don't have to work hard, right? When in reality, we are actually working harder than almost anybody else, Black men included, right? Because in a lot of ways, that shared maleness is something that can not completely overcome, but create a common ground in higher education that Black women don't have, right? And so for me, it was, I want other Black women and girls to know that this is common, but it's not you. Right? I said earlier that I spent a lot of time recognizing that I didn't feel comfortable at school. I didn't feel, a sense of belonging. I talk about getting to Vassar and then realizing that the people that I was there with had parents and grandparents, who had been attending the school for a century.
Yep.
And I didn't have any of that, right? And I wanted to write something, and for me, it was a little scary, right? Because it's like, are people going to read this? Are Black women going to read this and say, well, yeah, yeah, this happened to me, right? And it took me a while, a couple of years as I was writing this, to realize that that's okay. Right? I want them to read it and say, oh, yeah, that happened to me. Oh, yeah, that happened to me. Oh, yeah, that happened to me, right? And that wasn't about my life, right? Or my mistake, or, something disqualifying about me, but that I can fit that experience into this broader culture of higher education and these structural systems that are sort of perpetuating that culture. And so I wanted to write something both in style and tone that a 17 or 18-year-old Black woman in high school could read and see herself in, and a 65-year-old, Black woman, full professor who has been in this industry for 30 years could also see herself in. And I think it's important. It's not about being voiceless, right? We often talk about minority groups and like being voiceless, right? It's not being voiceless. We all have voices, right? It's using that voice and it's being heard. And what I really thought about this book and the stories that I have and the stories that other Black experiences is we have to be full-throatedly yelling this in the streets, right? When Claudine Gay is forced to resign and, accused of not just anti-Semitism, but not being right for the role, right, quote unquote, right? That is the sort of impetus of all of this, right? We spent, first of all, shortest president tenure in Harvard's history, 6 months, right? Mm-hmm. We spent 2 weeks in July talking about how amazing it is at the original higher education, right? Harvard is the first, Harvard and William and Mary sort of argue about this, but it's likely Harvard that was the first institution of higher education in the United States, right? And to have a Black woman there after almost 400 years of existence should say something about how we are moving forward as a society. But when that tenure gets truncated at 6 months because of, conservative attacks on DEI, on affirmative action, and on this woman as a symbol of those things, that tells me, you talked about the timing for this book being great. It certainly is, but it's a little sad in that way, right? That it's like, we're in 2024 and we just watched anti-Blackness remove the first Black president at Harvard University. And so we need to be saying these things. When Dr. Gay, she just wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, and she talks about that, right? She talks about this being a very clear example of racism and anti-Blackness in higher education, and the way that she has been compared to these other women who also testified. And that tells me that the book is needed, right? And hopefully it won't always be needed, but it is.
Well, Jasmine, I want to just thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I believe that our audience will resonate strongly with some of the things, of course, that you mentioned and the themes of your book. And so just want to thank you again for joining us. It was a fascinating conversation and look forward to what you will continue to do in the future. Thank you, Jasmine. Appreciate your time.
Thanks.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.